Hello, so in this lesson we are looking at something called levels of organisation. It's looking at food chains and food webs really, which is something I know you will have come across before, but adding a few extra bit which you might not have seen before. So we're going to quickly go over what food chains are, what they show, what the different levels are called, different parts of a food chain, names for them, and look at something then called population curves. So what I'd like you to do to start off with, if I press this one, is get a bit of paper. We've got 7 keywords down the left hand side and 7 definitions down the right hand side. What I'd like you to do is see if you can match up which ones go with which. Some of these words you'll have come across before, some you might not have, but you might be able to work out what is what based on what you do or you don't know. So pause the video, see if you can match them up, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully you have actually done that, not just, waited for me to start talking again. So if we go through the answers, start with food chain. A food chain is a sequence showing feeding relationships. A producer is an organism that makes its own food. Consumer is an organism that eats other organisms. A herbivore is an organism that only eats plants. Carnivore is an organism that only eats animals. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and animals, and a trophic level, which is possibly the word you haven't come across before, is a feeding level in a food chain. So let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. So if we look at a really simple food chain, we've got a leaf, which is eaten by a caterpillar, which is eaten by a bird, which is eaten by a fox. So this is a food chain. The arrows show the transfer of energy through this food chain. So energy stored within the leaf is transferred to the caterpillar when it eats it. Energy in the caterpillar is transferred to the bird when it eats the caterpillar, and energy in that bird is transferred to the fox when the bird is eaten. And then we can say about all the different stages. So we can say the leaf, this is a producer. So producers are pretty much always plants, organisms which are able to make their own food. So plants are producers because they can make their own glucose, their own food, by the process of photosynthesis. The leaf will be eaten by a caterpillar. We call this the primary consumer. So any animal, normally it's an animal, which gets energy from eating other organisms is a consumer. So our caterpillar is our primary consumer, our bird is a secondary consumer, and the fox is the tertiary consumer. You might have another one, a quaternary producer it's called, but food chains generally aren't much longer than that because at each stage energy is lost, and if you have too many stages there won't be enough energy to actually be able to support our organism to be able to survive. Now in the real world, it's never this simple. We don't have simple food chains like this. We'll have something a bit more complicated, which we call a food web, but it's exactly the same, just a little bit more complex. So we start with our producers, so plants, that kind of thing. They are eaten by our primary consumers. So this is an example of a food web, I think, in America. So these organisms are all herbivores because they eat plants. So they are our primary consumers. They are eaten by our secondary consumers, and then they are eaten by our tertiary consumers. And we might call something like a mountain lion an apex predator, because it's at the top of a food chain or a food web. And what we can do from this food web is we can look at individual food chains. So we can go from a plant to the Douglas squirrel, maybe to the black-tipped jackrabbit, and then to the coyote. So that's one example of a food chain. Or from the plant to the red-breasted nuthatch, to the western whiptail lizard, to mountain lion, for example. And then we can also look in food chains at the effect of actually changing the population of different organisms on other organisms. We're going to look at this a bit more in a minute, but if we look at, for example, the population of the pika, let's say suddenly they all die out, well, that's going to be a problem for the ringtail because ringtail eats quite a lot of pika, so maybe the population of that will decrease. Or it will start eating more tree frogs or more Douglas squirrels because it hasn't got as much pika for it to eat. So that means that the tree frog population and the Douglas squirrel population might decrease. Or if this one decreases, then there might not be as much food for the coyote. Or if this one decreases, then there might be more of these. So there's lots of different things that can happen in food web if you just change one organism. If we get rid of all the producers, well, everything else is going to die, because if there's no producers, there won't be as many primary consumers, there won't be as many secondary consumers, and there won't be as many tertiary consumers. So last lesson, we were looking at adaptations. Here's a couple of animals. We've got a lynx and we've got a snowshoe hare. These are again found in North America. You can quite clearly see from the pictures of them which one is the predator and which one is the prey. The lynx is a predator. Main features of predators is they have eyes on the fronts of their heads like that, like humans do, and that gives us binocular vision. That means that we are able to actually judge distances between where you are and where an object is. So if you're looking at your phone, for example, now you can actually judge how far away that phone is, which is useful if you want to touch the screen, because you know kind of roughly where to touch. On the other hand, the snowshoe hare has got eyes on the sides of its head. That's better for a prey, because if the eyes are on the sides of the head, they're able to see much further around them. Okay, if you are sat where you are with your binocular vision, you can see forwards, you can see slightly to the side, but you can't see kind of that far around you. If you're a prey, though, you want to be able to see around you, because that means you're going to be able to see if a predator is coming or not. And it's going to give you that kind of that warning sign earlier to try and escape. The problem with that is, because they don't have binocular vision, they can't judge distances as well. So although this snowshoe hare might be able to see if a lynx is coming, it won't be able to judge if it's really quite far away or if it's quite a lot closer. So that's a bit more difficult there. So this is a typical food chain that these are involved in. So we have plant, going to snowshoe hare, and then lynx. And if we look at the populations of these two species, we can actually see how closely they are linked. So hares and lynx, like I said, found in America, and actually they've been recording the populations of these for years. So if we look at the hare population since 1845 to 1925, we can see that the population goes up and down pretty much every kind of 10 years. There's a peak and then it drops again. If we then look at the lynx population, we can see that shows a similar trend as well. So the lynx population goes up and down, and we call this one a predator-prey relationship. So if we look at the hare population, first of all, the reason it might go up is because there might be more food for them to grow, for them to eat. So the vegetation, the plants will grow more, and if there's more food, then there's more for them to eat. And also, it's because of changes in the lynx population. So if the lynx population increases, then the amounts of hare will start to decrease. If we look at the lynx population, then they depend on the hares for food. So when there's more hares, there'll be more lynx, and if there's less hares, there'll be less lynx. So let's have a look a bit more about how that happens. So if we start, first of all, we've got individual hares, they fall in love, they have some babies, and so the hare population will start to increase. So the prey population is going up. What that means is there's lots of food for our lynx, our predators. So the lynx are more likely to survive, they can get their food, and they're more likely to reproduce as well. So the lynx population will start to increase too. It will increase slightly less because one lynx will eat more than one hare, and it happens slightly later because it takes time for this process to happen. So lynx population now starts to increase. What that means then for our prey population is that will start to decrease because more hares are being eaten, so there's going to be now less hares overall. That's bad news for the lynx because there's less food for them, so then the lynx population will start to drop as well. Now, because there's less lynx, there can be more prey, there can be more hares because there's going to be more food for them to eat because there's not as much competition and they're not being eaten by the predators as much, so the population of hares will increase as well. And if the population of hare increases, then the population of lynx will increase as well. So this kind of shows what is going on. If I go back to this graph here, that is showing what happens here. When there's an increase in hare population, then shortly after there'll be an increase in lynx population. That will cause the hare population to drop because more hares are being eaten, and then after that the population of lynx will decrease. Then there'll be a big increase in the population of hares because not as many are eaten, because there's more food for our lynx. They will start to increase a bit later. Now there's lots of lynx, so the population of hare will decrease as well. Because there's not as much food, then the population of lynx will decrease as well. And it goes up and down. And this cycle will continue, and it's a natural cycle that will continue unless something else happens which might affect the population of our predator or our prey. So this is called a predator-prey relationship. The last thing I want to look at is kind of the other changes that might happen in food webs. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier because our hares and the lynx don't live on their own. There are other organisms in the ecosystem that they live in which are kind of might potentially be affected. So if we look at this food web as another example, if we change, say, the population of spiders, how will that affect the other organisms in the food chain? Well, if there's fewer spiders, first of all, there's going to be fewer finch. Because there's fewer finch, because there won't be as much for the finch to eat. If there's fewer finch, then that might potentially affect the number of owls because they haven't got as much food. But because they also eat the blue tit and the vole, owls might be okay. But if there's fewer spiders, that means there's going to be more moths probably, because fewer of them will be eaten. If there's more moths, there might then be more blue tits because there's going to be more food for them as well. But if there's also more moths, there might potentially be less plants because more plants are being eaten. So just by changing one organism in the food web, that's going to have a big effect on the other organisms. So what I'd like you to do for today is go on Google Classroom, and there is this quiz called Levels of Organisation Quiz. And there's just a few questions that I'd like you to answer. It's multiple choice. And once you've done them, it should tell you straight away which ones you've got right or wrong. So for this week, what you need to have done is that quiz, the adaptations worksheet, which was for lesson 5. Also make sure you've done the work for the other lessons as well. If you haven't done it yet, you do need to, because this all needs to be caught up. We're not going to have time when school starts again to actually go over any of this stuff again in much detail. So please make sure you get that done. As always, any questions, please ask me. Thank you.